I'm not just some crazy girl. You'll believe me if you just take a moment and see the leech the way I saw it. I know you will. Just listen. It started when I was in Japan. I'd been living with a host family for a few months, and my semester abroad was almost over. I had the nerve to believe I'd begun to acclimate, that I understood their culture and could call myself one of them. On more than a few nights, gathered around the fire, they told me their superstitions and scary stories. Their myths were very different from the ones I'd grown up with, and I found them fascinating, but not scary. They were too different. There was a heavy emphasis on choice. Rather than facing a mindless slasher that simply wanted to kill you, many Japanese horror stories involved entities approaching an unwary victim in a public place and giving them a choice. If the victim answered one way, they would be killed horribly in a specific manner. If the victim took the other choice, they would be killed horribly in another specific manner. These unwinnable situations made me laugh until the father of my host family explained to me in quiet tones the true subtext. It was all about the third option. It was all about the innate fear of customs in a very traditional society. The only way to survive was to simply know the acceptable third answer and give that one instead. He squeezed my arm and told me that I, as a foreigner, stood no chance of knowing the third answer. If I saw someone approaching me in public, no matter how innocent it seemed, I was to run away before they could speak and give me that fatal choice. I smiled and laughed it off, but his warning made me shiver a few times over my last few days. As a girl alone in another country, I was already on guard while walking through public spaces, but the towering maze of Tokyo took on a grey and tense tone whenever I thought of what might lurk among the crowds. I stuck to paths that went through the many hidden gardens and parks, and I always looked around warily. That fear faded, though. I can't tell you why. Not exactly. I was young. I thought I was smart, and I was American. Nothing could really hurt me. And besides, I was one of them now, right? I'd spent months there living like they did. So, on my last day, when a woman began walking intently toward me from the opposite end of a long subway car, I stayed in my seat. She had long black hair, beautiful dark eyes, and a dark green dress that seemed out of place in a crowded car otherwise filled with grey shirts, dark suits, and white blouses. I saw these details about her before I saw the deep scars on her face and hands, as if a maniacal American slasher had brutally carved her up and left her to die some years ago. As she shuffled toward me, the lights flickered once. The boy in the seat next to me shivered and focused worriedly on his portable game. Adults looked away, tense, and the teenagers opposite me finally stopped talking and began staring at their shoes. They knew. They knew, and there was nothing any of them could or would do for me. I was a foreigner and a stranger to them. But they listened. Oh, did they listen? I could almost hear them straining their ears to hear her whispers over the keening of wheels on rails beneath us. Every small step the woman took seemed louder than the one before. Even then, I still didn't believe. I thought it was a prank, or someone being strange. I thought the others in the car with me were turning away out of courtesy or disgust at her scars. When I saw a tear fall from the cheek of the boy next to me, when I saw it splatter onto his game screen while he continued to pretend to play, that was when I understood. She stood directly above me, and I raised my eyes to meet hers. Her scars crinkled horribly as she gave me a seemingly innocent smile, and she asked, in a pleasant but whispery voice, "Do you have a sister?" I froze. If I said yes, what would happen? If I said no, what else would happen? When the lights flickered again and her face moved without moving right down close to mine, I almost panicked and told her the truth. Inches away from me, her smile widened. She turned her head slowly, horribly slowly, until her neck reached a 90-degree angle. On the verge of passing out from fright, I forced myself to start breathing again. Her smile turned into an angry frown. I cowered back against the person behind me, who shrieked. The scarred woman in green began to reach for me, but the car came to a smooth stop. The doors opened, and I dodged around her and ran out with the crowd. To their credit, none screamed. They simply hurried off to their various destinations while attempting to seem like nothing was wrong. Nobody wanted to draw attention to themselves. Nobody wanted to get noticed by the woman in green or by polite society. I ran all the way to my host family's house, but nobody was home. It was my last day, and we'd already said our goodbyes, but it still felt odd that they were gone. Still trembling, I took a taxi to the airport, made my flight, and tried to rationalize the encounter away. The only hint I had that it had even happened was a small cut on my upper arm where she had nearly grabbed me with her horribly long nails, a cut that had strangely already begun to heal into a scar. Hours into my international flight, I finally began to calm down, and I even started feeling a bit smug. Not only had I survived an encounter with a Japanese horror entity, I'd even managed to immediately take a flight straight the hell out of the entire country. I would not end up as another unwitting cautionary tale. I was a born and bred American girl that had seen every horror movie under the sun, and I'd made all the right decisions. Awesome. I told the story to a guy sitting next to me on my flight, and he asked, "What if she shows up here on the plane? Where will you run?" Yeah, I shut up right about then, and stayed tense for the next few hours. Eventually, though, I realized I would be doomed no matter what if the woman in the green dress showed up here. So I finally gave in and slept. Awake or asleep, it didn't matter. My neighboring guy woke me before we landed, joked that he'd kept guard, and reported that nobody had come for me while I'd been out. Half-heartedly thanking him, I made polite conversation, left the plane, got my stuff, and met my parents outside the airport. It was bright, sunny, and open here, and it was a relief to be back home. This was the land of simple horrors, of gory violence, zombies, and haunted locations. The scarred woman in the green dress would have no power here, if indeed she'd existed at all. I was talkative and happy on the ride home, and my parents were glad to see me. I didn't tell them about my horrible encounter, because it honestly slipped from my mind. Everything was good. I was safe. We pulled up to the house where I'd grown up, and it looked exactly like I'd remembered. Only a few months had gone by. True, but it had felt like a lifetime. Lugging in my stuff alongside my dad, I began to recount some funny memory that had come to mind. When I entered the front door, turned toward the kitchen, and saw her standing there, green dress, scars, smile and all. The woman from the subway car thousands of miles distant stood waiting for me in my childhood home. She gave that same eerie smile and lifted a large knife. I screamed and dropped my bags. Startled, my father dropped his too, and my mother rushed in from outside. The woman in green brought the knife down. She raised it, and then brought it down again, chopping vegetables. Mistaking my reaction, my mother began screaming with me, but happily, and she pulled me forward. "It's good to see your sister again, isn't it?" Suddenly, I was forced into a hug with both my mom and the woman in green. but instead of trying to hurt me, the horrible stranger just smiled. "It's good to see you, sis." I pulled away, trembling forcefully. I immediately sensed that something was off, and I'd seen enough movies to know to keep my cards close to my chest. "Mom, what's going on?" "What do you mean, honey?" she asked, smiling happily at us both before moving deeper into the kitchen to help cook. The scarred woman in green kept her gaze and neutral smile fixated on me as I moved away from her, around the kitchen island, and toward my mom. Why is she here? Who? Her? I returned the woman's stare. My mother laughed. "You've been away too long, dear. You remember that your sister's graduated and back from college now." I gulped. "Humor me, Mom. Why doesn't she look like us?" My father came down the stairs, returning from dropping off my bags, and gave me a black look. "I thought we were past this. It's not nice to keep harping on your sister for being adopted." Horrified, I took a step back and bumped into the fridge. But how? "Oh, I guess I'm super jet-lagged. Sorry. I was just trying to remember when that was. For a birthday present for her and all." My father sighed. "Same day you were born." He stepped out to get more bags from the car. I turned away, mortified. My sister never took her gaze off of me, almost taunting me with her expressionless invasion. As we both stood there, facing off silently, she lifted her knife and brought it down, on her own arm, right along one of her scars. She didn't flinch. Instead, I did. Gripping my arm and looking down, I saw the skin slice open, bleed, heal, and fade into a scar in moments. Aghast, I looked at her and saw the equivalent cut disappearing from her arm. Her smile grew a little wider. I opened my mouth to scream something with fury, but the scarred woman lifted a knife and pointed it at my mother's back. The implication was clear. The best I could do was to take the knife from her by offering to cook and insisting that my sister sit down at the table and relax. She did so, apparently willing to play a social game of cat and mouse. As I chopped up vegetables and stared at the scar on my arm, my thoughts raced. This entity had somehow attached itself to my life. Looking around at pictures in the kitchen, I saw her in photographs that I recognized, family photos that now included her as a child, as a teenager, as a woman, scarred from the outset. I kept my eyes on her as she sat at the table, and she stared right back at me the entire time. Her disfigured smile never once changed. We actually sat down and had dinner as a family. My parents didn't seem to notice that my sister never spoke unless directly addressed, and even then only with perfect politeness. She ate little and kept her eyes always on me. Halfway through dinner I got angry and I slammed my fist on the table. She took her dinner knife and drew it across her cheek. I fought hard not to scream as I felt my face split open, bleed, and then heal. Sasaum. I already knew there would be a scar, but I excused myself to go to the bathroom and look for myself. Once there, it occurred to me that the leech, a leech on my life, time, and soul, seemed to be punishing me for rudeness. I remember saying to the mirror, "All right, you bitch, I'll play your game. I just needed time to figure out." Another slice opened up near my ear, bled, and quickly healed over into a scar. She'd heard me from the dining room. Or she could hear me no matter what. Walking carefully back into the dining room, I put on my best graces and sat with a smile. I couldn't think about the scars. Were they permanent? Would I live the rest of my life disfigured? Plastic surgery might fix a few, but if this kept going, no, I would just have to be polite and proper until I could figure out how to destroy her. I volunteered to help clean up dinner and do the dishes, and my mother seemed surprised, saying that my time in Japan had done me good. I didn't know what she meant by that, but I managed to get through the evening without any further scars. That night, I tried to whisper to my father in the dark, but he didn't understand what I meant, and I earned another scar on my arm. I slipped downstairs and into her room. My sister sat holding a knife to her arm and grinning wider than I'd ever seen. "What do you want?" I asked her. She held the knife higher on her arm, just above a clear patch of skin where her scars had left her and been transferred to me. "Do you have a sister?" Suddenly remembering that moment of mortal threat in the subway car, I said nothing. She did not cut herself, but she did wait, always staring, ever staring. I backed out and went to my own bedroom, where I lay stressed for hours. I did sleep eventually, but only because jet lag forced me into it. The next few days were filled with terribly costly chess moves. I invited over old friends to see if they recognized her as my sister, and they did. For each of these conversations with confused friends, I earned another scar. The leech knew what I was trying to do, and she disapproved. The worst part was running into an ex-boyfriend and finding out that he didn't remember our relationship. After much pressure, he finally admitted, "I liked your personality, but I didn't ask you out, because of your scars. Sorry." I remember screaming and earning another scar for it. Rushing home, I looked at old yearbook pictures. The scars weren't just appearing now, they were appearing back then too. I'd always had them. That same ex-boyfriend would later remember asking out my sister instead. The leech was draining away my life right before my eyes. What would happen when she ran out of scars and I had them all? I couldn't talk to my parents. I couldn't talk to my friends. I shut myself in my room and spent each day alone to avoid any further social improprieties. I'd been raised American, raised rude, proud, and free, and I kept making mistakes. It was in me to swear, to nettle, and to tease, and the cost was just too high. My host family's father had been right. I was losing because I was from the wrong culture. Had I been a traditional and proper Japanese girl, the leech might never have punished me even once. The leech existed to punish deviance. The leech fed off of outsiders, rebels, and bad children. The leech was part of me now. She only had a few scars left when the idea came to me. She had this huge asinine grin all the time now, and stood in my room while I slept, staring at me, basically daring me to say something rude. She held a knife over me while I slept, yes, but it was not to cut me. It was to cut herself. And that's what gave me the idea. No. Furious and desperate beyond description, I decided that I wanted my life back at any cost. I'd been thinking of the leech in two ways. I could avoid being rude and live under her threat for the rest of my life. Or I could be myself and find out what punishment awaited once all the scars had been inflicted upon me. I feared that second option. I was terrified. When the leech became clear and beautiful, and I became horrid and misshapen, what would she do to me? Would she kill me? Discard me when I stopped being useful? Would I cease to exist altogether? Would my life completely become hers? I'd been so afraid of that second option. It took me until she only had one scar left to remember what my benefactor had said. There was a third option, one unknowable to any but the most socially integrated, and I'd had enough time to see that. For the leech, the social game went both ways. We were not in Japan. We were in America. Here, victims got tough when the end was nigh. She was with me always then. She walked directly behind me, goading me, irritating me, pushing me with her silence and her grin. Oh, that perfect smile on that beautiful face. It mocked me. I stood in the kitchen with her, and I drew out the same knife she had been holding when I'd first come home and found her attached to my life and timeline like the horrific leech that she was. I smiled at her, matching her expression, and I brought the knife down before she could react. Not on her, on myself. I slashed open my arm, and blood splattered across the kitchen island. She gasped and pulled back, her hair hiding her face. I saw her clutch her arm, and I saw a scar appear in the equivalent place where I had slashed myself. I wasn't healing, but I had actually managed to injure her. I'd thought long and hard about it. Cutting her would only mean cutting myself, but cutting myself meant cutting her. I slashed again, this time on my face. She screamed, "Finally, God!" I'd long prayed to hear that noise from her. I slashed again on my leg, and she fell to her knees. My blood splattered across her green dress, soiling it, and I slashed myself again and again and again. I felt faint, and still I cut myself, turning my arms, legs, face, and tummy into oozing mincemeat and gobs of flesh. With each strike, she screamed louder and crumpled further. I fell to my knees before her, a wall of pain and ebbing gore, and I smiled at her as her scream reached a crescendo that soared into nothingness. With a last gasp, she shrank and blackened until she became nothing more than a grasping little animal, an actual leech. Without a person to latch onto, she was nothing but a worm. With the last of my strength, I stood up and stomped on her. It was over. I called 911 after that, of course. And equally as expected, you think I'm crazy. But you have to listen. She was real, but she's gone now, and I'm not going to do this again. I killed her. I know I'll be scarred all over, just like she was, but at least I'll get to live. I'll get to swear. I'll get to drink. I'll get to... Remorse? For what? Why are you asking me that question? Find the guy on the plane. He'll tell you what I told him. No way he'd forget. You're not hearing me. Find anyone who was on the subway that day. In my car. They'll tell you. Why do you keep saying that? Stop asking me that question. She was a leech. She took everything that should have been mine. If she'd just never been adopted, it would have been my life. They would have been my friends, my boyfriends, my prom date. She was always there, always in my goddamn house, always so much better than me, always mocking me with that beautiful face. I don't have a sister. On the drive home for spring break, the very first thing I saw of my town was an enormous and many-spired church that had not been there before. I did a double take and drove by on my way in. Each spire was formed of 6 separate bands of crimson metal spiraling upward in a motionless pirouette that crested in a wicked point, slicing the air sharply enough that little trails of clouded moisture could be seen racing from their tips in the humid North Carolina afternoon. The 6 spires along the front of the otherwise bone-white church were higher on the sides and lower in the middle, forming the impression in my sight of the bottom row of some set of horrible demonic teeth. Only the sheer mundanity of the surrounding environment kept me from immediately labeling the place as evil. Over there was a wooded enclosure for dumpsters. Nearer was a wide parking lot with a scattered assortment of the run-down decade-old cars typical of my small town. And directly in front of my car, as I sat staring, was a garish, child-made sign for a coming bake sale. I shuddered, and then decided that I would never buy cookies from such a horrifyingly poor choice of architecture, well, unless they were really cheap, or unless they had the rare pistachio flavor I loved. It was just a building, I told myself, feeling strangely threatened. The next thing I saw after I shifted into drive and continued on was a raised axe chopping down on something behind an approaching row of bushes. Watching intently as the green angled past, I sighed with relief and waved at old man Kern. He smiled and waved back before continuing to chop wood. A small pile of split logs had already built up along the side of his house, and he threw another piece on top as I turned and lost sight of him. Numerous children were playing in the yards on my street. I slowed to make sure I didn't accidentally hit any as they ran this way and that, throwing balls or screaming. One was sitting on her porch looking downcast, and I watched her as I passed. She did not move. Frowning, I pulled into the driveway of my home and got out to begin grabbing my stuff from the trunk. Well, what could I do? I carried my backpack and duffel bag inside while bracing against the inevitable family rush. But it never came. Wandering through the house in a daze of remembrance and happiness at being home after so long spent at college, I smiled as I found my mom in the kitchen. "Hey, I'm back." "That's great," she replied, her tone genuinely warm. She kept her eyes on her work. "I'm making a pie. I'll be done in just a minute." I watched her fold dough with flour-covered hands for a moment, surprised. My mom had always been a rather hardcore anti-traditionalist. "When did you start making pies?" "A lot of things have changed since you've left me with an empty nest," she teased, still focused on the crust she was making. "I've had to pick up hobbies to fill the time." "Claire doesn't keep you busy?" I joked right back. She didn't answer. Moving on through the house, I called out for my younger sister, but no reply came. Heading upstairs, I dropped my stuff off in my room, sat on my old bed, gazed around at all the stuff I'd partially forgotten about, and generally took in a refresher on my old life. Nothing in this room had changed a single bit, and it felt good to know that not everything was constantly in transition. Classes, friends, dorm rooms, it all changed regularly, and even that pattern would shift when I graduated. Nothing was solid. Nothing felt real. Nothing except this unchanging room. Even my sister would be different. I hadn't been able to make it home for winter break, so she would be half a year older now, and at that age, half a year was an eternity. Getting up and heading down the hall with a smile, I carefully tapped on her door. There was no response. "Claire, I'm coming in," I called carefully. After another few beats, I pushed open the door and gagged. The smell was horrible. Her room was cluttered nearly beyond recognition. Food wrappers littered the floor like a thick carpet of leaves in a forest, and stacked piles of dirty clothing filled the corners in far greater amounts than she had ever owned. A few flies batted bodily at the window, and I picked my way across the uneven floor and opened it to let fresh air in. What the hell was this? There was no way Mum didn't know about this. 2, when I'd mentioned Claire's name, she hadn't responded. Were they having some sort of bitter teenager-parent conflict? Rooting through the garbage, I found my sister's well-worn diary. Apologizing under my breath, I opened it and leafed through. Summer, normal entries. Fall, normal entries. In October, the writing turned heavier, as if she was writing angrily. The entries turned to talk of conflicts with our mum, as I'd expected. But one strange line caught me off guard. Tried to call Nathan, but Mum took away my phone. I swallowed unhappily. That wasn't at all how our family usually operated. Had my sister been suffering for months without being able to contact me? The last entries devolved into huge angry script. Single sentences took whole pages. I hate her. I hate her. I hate her. But that had been 3 months ago on the entry marked December 25th. No more writing followed for nearly the whole diary. The very last page seemed to have something written on the back, but it had been stuck to the binding by small brown splatters that I assumed were coffee stains. I tugged at the paper a bit before deciding not to mess with it. Better not to leave evidence that I'd read her diary. Dropping the book, I headed downstairs and stood with my arms crossed, watching my mom working on a second pie crust. "Something wrong between you and Claire?" She didn't respond. I took in a deep breath. "If you don't want to talk about it, that's fine. but at least tell me where she is." She just kept tugging and pulling the flattened dough. I was beginning to feel strange about all this. "Seriously, where's Claire, Mom?" When she continued saying nothing, I grabbed her arm. At that, she finally turned and looked at me with flaring anger. "You mind your own business, Nathan. I'm just trying to hold this family together the best I know how, and right now, I'm making a goddamn pie." She'd never sworn at me before. I pulled back in confusion. "Things have not been good with you, gone," she continued, turning back to the crust. Her tone became almost sweet. "I know I'm not in the best mood right now. When we go to church tomorrow, we can talk, all right?" "Okay." I backed away then and headed for the front door. We'd never gone to church before. What had caused her to start going now? The thought of my mother entering that bone-white church with its teeth of red spires made me shiver. I wanted to find Claire, but that same girl was sitting on her porch staring at the ground. Cutting through the chaotic swarms of playing kids, I approached cautiously. She was a long-time neighbor, but she'd been littler last we'd seen each other, and I wasn't sure if she remembered me. "Hey, Madison, are you all right?" She looked up in wonder from behind unkempt brown hair. "You mean me?" Making a show of looking around, I said, "Who else is there?" Popping up onto her sneaker-clad feet, she grabbed my wrist. "Do you have any food?" It was pure instinct. I pulled back my hand. "Food? What?" I shook my head. "Hold on." Leading her back up her own porch, I knocked on her front door. After not getting an answer, I slowly inched my way in while looking around. I recognized the bald head in the living room. Approaching the big soft chair with the girl in tow, I coughed. Her father continued watching television, but asked, "Who sat?" It's Nathan, sir, your next-door neighbor." Stepping closer, I moved into his sight. He tilted his head to look past me. "Ah, nice to see you, boy. Get out of the way, though. Kindly." "I don't know if this is my place," I said nervously. He was known to be a gruff man and very direct about his views on raising his children. "But I think your daughter's hungry." He didn't respond. "Did you hear me?" He said nothing. I reached forward and poked his bare shoulder next to the yellow stains in his A-shirt. He snapped his head to look at me and growled, "Screw off! I'm busy!" His attention turned back to the television just as quickly. Shaken, but unwilling to leave the girl hungry, I led her into the kitchen while constantly checking to see if her father was getting up. At no point did he even so much as glance at us. The cupboards were empty of immediately edible food, but there were still substantial stores of goods that could be cooked. With amateur hands, I got stuff out and made a meal, making sure to show her how to do it herself in case her father continued to neglect her. She listened intently through each step of the process, taking in every detail. Once it was done, she began wolfing down the food like she was starving. Sitting awkwardly at her kitchen table while her father continued to ignore us, I asked, "Have you seen my sister, Claire?" Mouth full, she gave an exaggerated nod. "Where at?" After taking a big swallow, she told me, "The school. That's where all the big kids go." "On a Saturday?" She didn't seem to understand the question. "Well, find me next door if you need any help, okay?" Her nod this time was small and utterly relieved. I still felt the urge to stay, but the need to make sure my sister was safe was stronger. With a pained sigh, I headed back out into the afternoon heat. But the swarms of children were all gone. The neighborhood was deathly silent. No buzzing mosquitoes, no birds, and no lawnmowers. The symphony of a normal Carolina afternoon had abruptly ended while I'd been inside. As I stood looking around in tense confusion, I sighted a small boy hiding in a deep bush, staring at me in fear. Before I could ask him what was going on, I heard a footfall. But this was no normal footfall. I was outside on a hot and humid summer day near a wide lane flanked by houses, yet the echo was that of a formal shoe hitting polished marble between high pillars in some vast cathedral-like space. The slow and measured rap, 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 and their following echoes seemed to be coming from down the street, and I began to see something moving past the bushes and trees. To my right, the hiding child gestured frantically. Wary, I moved out to the sidewalk, where I could see a distant figure walking down the center of the street. Whoever it was, they looked to be wearing white robes with a red hood that obscured their face. Behind me, the boy in the bushes began sobbing, and I had the sudden instinct that he was not afraid for himself, but for me. Looking up, I sighted a horrified teenage girl hiding in the thickest parts of a nearby tree. Her eyes shifted rapidly from me to the approaching robed figure and back, and she repeatedly tilted her head forcefully away from that stranger as I stared at her. All right. I could take a hint. Full of apprehension, but not sure why, I began to run. If the robed figure had spotted me, it gave no indication. Its eerily echoing footfalls continued at the same measured pace as I fled down the other end of the block, heading for the school. Distance did not dim the sound of hard shoes slapping on marble. 1 block away, then 2, then 3. I still heard it, as if it was right on top of me, and still as if we were in a temple-like space together. Only when I reached the chain-link fence surrounding the school's football field did it stop, and even then the cessation was completely abrupt. The last footfall echoed in my ears, with the sibilant undertone of a toothed and confident grin unseen behind a red hood. I didn't wait or look behind. I ran for the gymnasium. Bursting within, I ducked as a baseball bat arced for my head. I tumbled on the smooth floor and held up my arms as figures rushed at me. "Wait!" a female voice shouted. It was familiar but older somehow. "That's my brother!" Clambering up, I stared around at the population of what might have been a school dance in another set of circumstances. Half a high school of kids all along the range of teen years stood watching me in return. Sleeping bags and low-cloth barriers had been erected like some sort of refugee camp, and massive stockpiles of supplies lined the back walls underneath our school's sports victory banners. From near these stacks came my sister, thinner yet fuller of face somehow. Nate. She hugged me tightly, and a surge of pent-up worry flooded through me. "Claire, what the hell is going on here?" "What about the rest of the world?" she asked desperately. "Did you bring rescue?" "Rescue?" I shook my head and gazed at the dirty and stressed faces beyond hers. "Rescue from what?" An older boy stepped forward. "So nobody knows what's happening here?" "No." They were all deadly serious. Claire let go of me and turned to the others. She spoke loudly so that everyone could hear. "Then that means the rest of the world is safe. We should make a run for it." She shivered mightily with hope as she turned back to me with wide eyes. "Shit! Do you have your car?" There was the swearing again. What had happened to my family and the town? "Claire, you have to tell me what's happening. I just got here and I don't understand." She looked to the older boy who had spoken, and he grabbed me by the arm and led me roughly toward the doors back to the football field. Cracking open one, he pointed. That happened. A sourceless chill breath rolled across the back of my neck as I spotted the white-robed, red-hooded figure standing on the other side of the chain-link fence watching us. It made no move to enter, yet did not retreat. "Who is that?" "More like what?" The boy shook his head. He was the priest at the new church. Nobody's sure when it was built. Sometime near the start of the school year, it was just There, but a lot smaller than it is now. Only a few people were going, I asked, staring at the distant figure with horror. Well, yes, but that's not what I meant. The church itself was smaller then. And finally breaking my gaze away, I studied his face for sincerity. What? Is it being added to? Where's the construction equipment? He just shook his head and backed away. Claire rushed close and pulled at my pockets. Your cell phone. She got it out of my pocket and frantically tapped at it before handing it to me. Open it. We have to call someone. Unlocking it, I gave it back, and she frantically began dialing. Holding the phone up to her ear, she paced the gymnasium while the large number of other students watched her hopefully. It seemed each of them had their own corner among the sleeping bags and short cloth cubicles, and they had all become very used to remaining in place. Peering back outside at the robed figure, I asked the older boy, "What does he want?" "Hell if we know. But any kid he captures is never seen again," he responded, holding his hand forward. "I'm Marcus." Gripping his hand, I told him, "It's good to meet you, Marcus. I don't know what's been going on here, but we're going to put a stop to this." He pursed his lips, but said nothing. On the other side of the gymnasium, Claire began sobbing. Leaving the door to jog to her, I accepted both her sudden, intense hug and the phone. Lifting it to my ear while she remained wrapped around my midsection, I listened. There was a strange background clicking noise and a haughty, sibilant whisper. "Nathan." I gulped. "Yes? You are nearly of age. You are invited to attend the Church of the Sacred Way." Partially dragging my sister along with me, I moved to a window and looked out. The robed figure moved slightly with the words being spoken, indicating that it was him talking, but his white-clad arms were by his sides. Did he have a cellular device under his red hood? How had he intercepted her call? How? "Only adults may attend the Church of the Sacred Way. I hope you realize what an honor this is." "I do," I told him, just to keep him talking while I tried to figure out how that distant figure was speaking to me. "What do I have to do?" "Simply come to the cathedral tomorrow at noon. All will be revealed to you, child." Where was his goddamn phone? I could see his hood shifting with the movements of his mouth. "Child, I thought you said only adults were invited." "All the uninitiated are children. The sacred way is how you become an adult. You must witness the truth and accept your holy responsibility in this life. Will you be there, Nathan?" My fingers had become ice cold around the phone. Sure. The strange, uneven clicking in the background continued for a moment, and then the phone went dead. Bits of frozen moisture had formed around the screen, and I carefully placed it on the floor and backed away. Many of the students had their heads in their hands and sat hopeless, while others had gotten up and were discussing plans for escape. Claire let go of me and bitterly joined these discussions. But much ado was made about other students that had set off for nearby towns without result. When they asked me if I'd heard anything from anyone about the situation here, I had to tell them I hadn't. Surely, if a terrified teenager had shown up warning of a strange threat back home, someone would have done something. "Are you safe here?" I asked them. Marcus nodded. "It doesn't come on the school grounds for some reason." He looked over at those talking about running. "It's not going to work. Trying to run is stupid. Nobody's made it, and that thing is always out there. I think we should fight." "Fight?" "Yeah. Follow me." He took me deeper into the school through halls lit only by afternoon sunlight. The complex was quiet. and empty, save for one room that held a man drawing equations on the walls. Numbers and signs covered the entire room floor to ceiling, and he had begun again, darkening the nonsense math and science into oblivion. Marcus took some food out of his pocket and threw it in before closing the door and moving on. Leading me into the science lab, he showed me an array of prepared bottles. We've had months to figure this out, but we can't get close to the church. At my approach, he stopped me with a hand. Careful. It's more or less napalm. Whoa. Stepping back, I held up my hands. I don't know. Did it invite you? He glared at me intently. I'm not. Did it invite you? I gulped again. Yes. With masked fury, he said quietly, Then I think you should put these under your jacket and take the priest up on his invitation. When you get inside, burn that godforsaken place to the ground. He was serious. Joining the others in the gymnasium again, I told them, I'm going to go get my car and look around. I can outrun the priest, yeah? They nodded, and others agreed to act as a distraction while I slipped out. Claire clenched her hands. And then we make a run for it? Marcus watched me from behind the crowd. I glanced at him, and then at my sister. Sure. Evening was coming on as the other students made noise, and I ran toward the opposite side of the school. I'd attended this place for 4 years, and now it all seemed so alien. I recognized some of the kitsch on the walls, and there was even a photo of the soccer team that still had me in it from our local championship year. But without electricity, and by the orange evening light, all these reminders of my life at home were twisted and off-putting, bursting out into that familiar front parking lot. I aimed for a wide arc around the priest's assumed location. It was only a few blocks, but my heart slammed in my chest throughout. Was something supernatural really going on? Or had everyone just breathed in fumes or chemicals and lost their minds? All I knew for sure was that my little sister was scared, and that I had left her here in the clutches of danger for half a year. I would not leave her again. I was the man of our family. It was up to me. As I completed my wide circle, I saw the axe again, this time glinting yellow and gold. Old Man Kern smiled and waved as before. I approached, thinking that he might be unlike the others who hardly responded to me and not at all to younger kids. As I neared the corner of his house, I saw what I had missed before, and I ran away as fast as I could, pushing into my house covered in sweat and full of terror. I stomped into the kitchen, where my mum was making pie crusts. "Stop!" I shouted at her, grabbing her arms. She screamed and fought violently against me, pushing me off. When she grabbed a knife, I backed off, and she returned to her activity immediately. I felt like sobbing, but I only let a few tears fall. This was no time to lose it. The next room held evidence of her madness. Old Man Kern's backyard had been filled to the brim like a lumber yard, and similarly, the next room beyond the kitchen was piled high with thousands of pie crusts. At her, I shouted, "Why? Why are you choosing this monotonous, repetitive nonsense over your own kids?" "I must remain worthy," she murmured back without looking at me. "Working hard means you're worthy." "But it's pointless. You're not doing anything." She hummed a little tune before saying, "The world needs its pie crusts." Vehement now, I spat. "Machines make pie crusts, Mom. You're not accomplishing anything. If you don't work hard, you're garbage," she whispered, kneading dough. "Useless flesh to be discarded." Full of fear and pain, I ran out into orange-grey fading twilight. My car was right there in the driveway, but I ran next door and entered without waiting. The neighbor girl's father sat watching television, and she was in the kitchen having middling success at cooking another meal. At seeing me, her jaw trembled. "Come on," I told her. "We're getting the hell out of here. Something's horribly wrong with this whole town." She nodded and took my hand. What about my dad? Putting her behind me, I approached the bald man in the chair. What to say to him? If you don't work hard, sir, you're garbage. Useless flesh to be discarded, right? He glared, but kept his gaze locked on the television. I do work hard. It's my patriotic duty to watch and listen. We gotta stay in the know. Gotta stay vigilant. For the first time, I actually looked at the screen. I'd assumed he was watching a show or the news. No, not at all. The images on that lit screen were at first nonsensical, but then, as my brain began to make sense of them, I started to parse the moving shapes and blood and bone landscape upon which they moved. Upon hills of quivering flesh, a white-robed and red-hooded figure walked, talking calmly and consistently about truth and the sacred way. These words simultaneously made no sense to me, and yet were almost understandable. Madison said, "I've tried to listen to it. It's just random noise. I don't understand it at all." But I almost could. I was nearly an adult. "Come on, let's go to my car." Running outside, I kept her hand held tight, curving around the bushes to my car at top speed. But white and red emerged from behind green, and Madison was slower to stop than me. As I stumbled and fell roughly to the side on the pavement of my driveway, I heard her scream in abject terror, and I saw white robes open to reveal gore-covered bones in front of a vast valley of living grotesqueries. The landscape from her father's television was inside that entity, behind blood-dripping bones. A gateway to nightmare revealed itself until those robes closed once more, and she was gone. Looking up, I saw 6 spiraled, sharp crimson teeth set in a white bone jaw. Just barely visible under the hem of that red hood, the priest was grinning. "See you tomorrow, Nathan." I screamed incoherently in rage and sorrow, but Madison was gone, and the robed entity began walking away down the street, with those same eerily echoing footsteps on unseen marble. For the moment, I was exempt from its hunt, for I was already slated for another fate. I screamed angrily after him before leaping up and getting in my car. I would run that demonic thing down with the weight of mankind's machinery, and it would become bloodied bone dust under my wheels. I turned the key in the ignition, but nothing happened. For a time, I was nothing but screams of rage and fists pounding on the dashboard. Under the shroud of night, in a town that no longer had electricity to hold back the darkness, I resorted to bitter walking now that I knew I would not be captured directly. I had an idea what I would find, given that my car did not work and my phone had literally frozen over, but the satisfaction of being right was little consolation. The road I had come in on now ended in a wall of softly glowing crimson mist that smelled of iron and pain. In a way, this made some of the older denizens of our area correct. There was nothing outside of our town. The rest of the world was just a concept, and our local community was all that mattered. Walking back to the school took time, but I had no thoughts, just hollow hurt. Something had crept upon my home like a cancer, and it now had all of our elders in its grips. We were alone, and I was next. The younger kids had done well in surviving this long, but it was all inevitable. There was nowhere to go and no escape. Time would march forward and age all of the remaining children into adults. And then it would have us. I entered that gymnasium to find Claire, Marcus, and 3 others awake and on watch. Claire was relieved to see me, but to Marcus I said, "We fight." He did not smile. He simply nodded. Our fires were already matched in fury. My sister was finally able to sleep now that I had returned, and I sat watching over her through the dark hours of the night. The kids had done well in the business of stockpiling food and maintaining some semblance of order, and I was impressed that teenagers had done all this without guidance. Claire had told me while falling asleep that before it had gone down permanently, the internet had filled their heads with random knowledge, and together they'd collectively been able to cover the range of necessary skills and plans. That was their defense, she reasoned. Knowledge allowed independence, and independent thought was somehow the enemy of that creature that stalked them. While guarding her that night, I thought long and hard about that. Would I have enough independent will to choose differently than my elders? From my mum's mention of going to church tomorrow, they expected me to join them, and I'd seen more than a little bit of violent reaction when I'd attempted to go against their set minds. Violence was scary, but the thought of my sister being taken into that place of suffering I'd seen was too much. I was walking there now, half in its world and half out. The sloping hills squished and oozed bile under my bare feet, and the air was fire and agony. The disjointed bones of ancient beasts protruded as mountains on the horizon, and a river of blood flowed past as I stumbled toward a closed great eye in the sky. It began to open, the slightest glare searing my very spirit with the infinite tortures of a massive eternal mind gone mad. And I opened my mouth to scream, but found that I had no lungs. Marcus shook me awake. "Don't sleep. On the verge. You'll dream. Poorly." Still shivering, I said, "Poorly? Christ." He nodded. "It's beginning for me, too. I would have been next if you hadn't come back." "So your plan?" "Yes." Morning light was streaming in through the windows of the gymnasium. "I won't let you down." I looked at Claire's face, peaceful in sleep, still older than I remembered. "If I don't come back, I'll take care of her. You should go before she wakes up and tries to stop you." Yes, that was a good idea. I wasn't sure I could leave if she was screaming and crying for me to stay. Wordlessly, Marcus and I went to the chemistry lab, Irhus. I donned the heavy jacket he'd picked for this occasion, and we carefully stocked pockets he'd sewn inside with a dozen bottles of pseudo-napalm. Feeling terribly like a suicide bomber, I steeled myself and began walking toward the ghastly church on the horizon as the sun rose in the sky. Mixing with streams of blank-eyed adults as they made their pilgrimage, I tried to control my breathing. The stress felt nearly overwhelming, and I was worried there was a real risk I would pass out. I had napalm strapped near my chest, and I was walking toward a monstrous otherworldly church among a river of fanatical believers. What hope could I have? What chance was there to survive this? The bone-white, red-spired church loomed even larger than I'd remembered it. This time, I could see that the vehicles in the parking lot were run down and unused, and the dumpster hosted a thick cloud of flies on what looked like discarded flesh. This building might once have started out legitimate, but something had overtaken it and corrupted its former use. The white-robed, red-hooded priest stood outside the church, both nodding at its incoming flock and guarding against any possible action by the children from the school. At seeing me, it stepped forward, and I feared I'd been caught out, but it just raised a blood-dripping skeletal hand and drew a hot, liquid symbol on my forehead. "Welcome, child." Shaking badly, I automatically said, "Thanks. Do not be nervous. All will be made clear inside." "Okay." Stepping past, I continued on with the stream of believers and approached the wide and tall doors. They were white, but at this distance I could see off-colouring. Like teeth in a gumless mouth, they waited to swallow us. I held my breath as I crossed the threshold, and my instinct was correct. The air on the other side held subtle fire and agony like it had in my dream. And I knew then that this was a pocket of hell. And judging from the inside, it was growing. The corrupted approximations of a church all existed within, but in unholy form. Long, red-dripping bones formed pews. The walls were fleshy and had human skin in patches, and the windows were instead hundreds of little eyes that constantly turned this way and that, studying the patrons below. The light came from small floating flames, and a closed great eye rested on the far wall above an altar of filth and the priest's waiting podium. Where I might have expected a cross below that great eye, instead there beat a tremendous heart. The church was alive. Too scared to yet make my move with the napalm, I found my mom and sat next to her. "I'm glad you came," she told me, giving a genuine smile for the first time since I'd come back. "I hope they don't discard your flesh. You're a smart boy with great potential. I've told everyone that 100 times." Skin crawling as the wetness on the bone pew worked its way through my jeans. I said, Thanks, Mom. I guess." Her eyes lit up. "Shh! It's time." The priest stood starkly for a moment inside the doors, which closed like a jaw behind him. Then, moving forward, he held both the eyes of the congregation and the eyes on the walls. I watched, heart pounding, as he ascended to the podium and said, "We have a new member today. Nathan, approach." Smiles and cheers arose as I stood and began carefully stepping along the intestinal lining that formed the center aisle. I stood at the front and the priest approached. Looking back, I saw my entire adult community present. They were all here, and all exuberant for me to join. And up on the balcony overhead, I saw a choir of missing children. Madison stood among them, her eyes wet from tears, but her mouth open to join in their horrific song of clicks and screeches. She wasn't dead. Part of me was relieved. The priest was talking, but I'd taken too long. A small sliver of light appeared from behind me, and I knew then that the great eye was opening. That leathery hemisphere of flesh was parting. I turned to face it, and the light reached my face. To say that I screamed then would be an understatement. Every single neuron in my mind flared with the truth, and I could suddenly feel my soul. I had one, it was real, and it was screaming with every fiber of its existence. While my mind burned and my soul screamed, every cell in my physical body rejoiced. This was from whence they had come, these trillion little animals that formed my every tissue and internal liquid, and recognized like. If heaven was a place of spirit, hell was a place of flesh, and we humans were the unlucky minds caught between. The pull began to rip me apart. But the image of my sister sleeping on that hard gymnasium floor, hungry and scared, blocked out the pain. I'd seen her as a baby. I'd seen her take her first step. We'd fought at times and been friends at others. When my father had died, it'd been up to me to fill that role for her, and I felt I'd failed that by going away to college. But the independence I'd found there was just the sliver I needed. It was time for me to join my family in swearing. Closing my eyes and shutting out the fire of truth, I pulled out a bottle of napalm and hurled it at the great eye above with a roaring, "Fuck you!" The entire church trembled from its very foundations as the eye shrieked an earthquake and closed in response to the shards of glass and a man-made form of fire. I pulled another and threw it at the heart below. Flames boiled up, bringing a wave of horrific stench. The priest reached for me, but I ran with eyes streaming along various organs, throwing napalm this way and that. The congregation reached for me, but I kicked and punched and bit against their weight and did my best to hurl the bottles away from them. The jaw-like front doors opened reflexively in pain, and I paused on the other side to throw my last napalm up into the glands above. The crowd followed me, yelling and shouting, but more to throw their flaming clothes on the ground rather than chase me. Looking back, I saw the priest standing stock still beneath the boiling great eye, now in ruins. That red hood slowly lifted under a bloody boned hand, and it revealed its familiar face to me. "You should have joined us," it whispered with the voice of my father. "You could have had him with you again, but now, never, fool child." Under the noon sun obscured by a towering pillar of smoke, I fell to my knees crying for more reasons than I could process. Could it really have given us our father back? I would never know. Men and women tumbled around me on fire from my actions. Had I lost my mind? Had all this been a delusion? Had I thrown napalm on innocent men and women? I stumbled away from the ghastly, deflating pile of organs that had once been a church as it burned and smoked like seared meat, and I did not stop running or crying until I reached my home. This time, the car turned on, and the music on the radio revealed that the rest of the world was connected to us again. Driving crazily toward the school, I crashed right through the chain-link fence and screamed, "Claire, it's time to go!" Marcus appeared first, practically dragging her. The other students were slower, and after Marcus pushed Claire into the car, I pulled away. I was too panicked to wait. "Go!" Marcus shouted. "Now! We'll send someone back for the others." The best way out of town was past the burning church, and I wanted my mother to take the fourth seat in the car besides, terrified. But pulling up in the spot I'd first stopped at upon my return, I watched the crowd there looking at each other in confusion. The adults seemed to have no idea what was happening. "Is Mom there?" Claire asked, staring out the window. I turned to Marcus. "Keep the car on." He nodded and climbed into the front seat as I dashed out toward the burning monster that had now stopped shrieking and grown quiet. "Nathan?" my mum asked as I pushed through and approached her. "Nathan, oh Lord, Nathan, you're safe." "Yeah, on guard." I studied the confused faces all around. "Mum, you need to come with me, right now." "Oh, I can't leave," she murmured. "Look." Past her, the crowd had begun knotting around the fly-dominated dumpster. "It's not the best quality," she said, giving a small laugh. "Obviously, since it was discarded. But it'll have to do." She moved off to join the thickening circle. I stared in horror as grown men and women began cutting off limbs with sharp fragments of the old church. The flesh from these limbs curled away, and their bones began germinating into the white foundation of a new church. Their blood began hardening and spiraling up into small, delicate spires on top, and teeth being freshly pulled started growing into a new door. I backed away slowly. Their truth still burned in me, but it was not my truth. Once I climbed back into the car with a haunted look. Marcus asked, "Did you find her?" Claire watched me with fear and hope. I could only shake my head. "She's gone. That's not our mother anymore. Just go." He nodded and shifted the car into drive. Down the road, the crimson mist was gone, at least for now. For the next hour, we drove in silence, and I saw Marcus hold my sister's hand at times. We would find someone. Together, we would convince someone. The police, the military, the highway patrol, it didn't matter. Someone had to be told. We just had to reach the internet and spread the word. Knowledge and independence, right? We had that. We would win. Someone would come back here and torch that abomination to the ground. Claire and Marcus still have that hope now that we've reached a big city, but I no longer do. I've seen their truth. I've seen the awful inversion, seen the reality of it, and worse, I've been looking to the sides rather than ahead like the two of them. I didn't say anything, but we passed 3 fellow small towns on the way, and each of them had crimson spires rising above the treetops in the distance, like the bottom half of a jagged and grinning mouth. I like to think I have a little trick for saving on my taxes. I do them on every tax website I can find before going with the one that gives me the best numbers. My friends call it an excessive waste of a week, but I know it's worth it. Thing is, I put my trust in the wrong website this time around, and I don't know where to turn. The biggest hint should have been its newness. This was the first time I'd ever seen it, and it was so new there were only a few mixed reviews by other tax hounds like myself. Not one of them had gone for it yet, despite describing its numbers as, admittedly, the best return. Some cited a sense of unease, and 1 or 2 chalked it up to not trusting an unknown site. After all, the risk of fraud had to factor into the equation. I did my taxes on it, and, like usual, stopped before hitting submit. The number was absurdly good. Normally, I paid at least 20 grand in taxes on my 1099 income each April. But this website was showing that I'd get a return of about 5,000. I hadn't gotten money back in a decade. I had no idea how this was possible, and suspecting a scam, I began reading through the legalese. It was buried in the fine print on the help page, but it was there. This website achieved huge deductions by using a new and obscure loophole. Apparently, thanks to our recent new leadership, it was possible to exempt oneself from useless social services and keep all of your tax money except for the part that went toward national defense. I liked the sound of that, but I still hesitated. Taking a night to think about it, I invited my friends over to my place. As usual, they agreed that taxes were theft of my hard-earned money, but they weren't receptive to deeper levels of discussion. I understood. I often took it a little further than most. These guys just had a CPA do their taxes for them. They didn't get it. They just weren't as sharp as I was. The moment they left, I decided to go with that new tax website. I clicked submit and watched my accounts like a hawk. Everything seemed on the up and up. Nothing extra was taken, and the IRS electronically confirmed. It wasn't a scam as far as I could tell. The one odd thing was that my refund had to come in the form of cash. The very next morning, I checked my mailbox and found a thick envelope on top of the usual junk mail. I opened it carefully, and then quickly closed it again while scanning the street. It was a nice enough neighborhood lined with old trees, big houses, and small children playing on lush green yards. But one can never be too careful. The envelope was stuffed with thousands in cash. A businessman in a suit stood at a distant corner, but as I eyed him warily, he just watched from afar. He was nobody. I clutched the envelope to my chest. The glee I felt at that moment was fantastic. I was smarter than all the other tax hounds, and I'd managed to get back an enormous amount that they'd been too scared to shoot for. I was worried my smile would extend right off of my face, and I practically dashed back into the house. That great feeling faded as I spread the $5,000 on my kitchen table and realized that there was something wrong. The bills were dark blue. Weirder still, they were slightly warm, as if they'd just been printed. Counterfeit. These were counterfeit bills. They'd scammed me after all. My money must have been redirected to their accounts. I smashed my coffee mug on the hardwood floor before managing to get my bitter anger under control. What to do? Right. Call the police. They'd sort this out. The phone rang a few times before a female voice answered with a tired spiel containing the police department's name and county. "How can I help you?" I gave my name and said I had a counterfeit money and tax scam to report. "Hello? Is anyone there? Glaring, I took in a breath to demand answers, but I caught sight of something dark, tall, and spiny across the street. Looking again, I saw nothing but a clear road with children playing on the opposite lawn. Disturbed and confused, I asked, "Can you hear me? If there's anyone on the line, please call 911 if this is an emergency. Otherwise, have a good day." A click followed. My phone buzzed as a text message from an unknown number arrived. It said, "Law enforcement agencies included under opt-out agreement. Please refrain from wasting department resources with frivolous calls." I stared at my cell phone until it automatically went dark. The opt-out program was real. Fine. I could take care of myself. I didn't need the police. But if this was real, I looked again at the blue cash laid out on my table. Maybe I hadn't read closely enough. Surely something confirmed with the government had to be genuine in some respect. Were these a new style of currency I'd simply missed hearing about? Curious, cautious, and still a little angry, I stacked the cash, stuffed it in a pocket, and went out for a drive in my BMW. Just as I was leaving my neighborhood, I thought I saw something large and horrific in my rearview mirror. But when I looked back, nothing was there. Growing increasingly unnerved, I headed to the nearby Whole Foods. I surveyed the parking lot, but saw no sign of the large black blur I'd noticed in the corner of my vision twice now. I wandered the aisles for a few minutes, looking for something random and cheap to attempt to buy with my blue cash. I settled on a can of soup and headed up to the front, with it one hand and a blue 20 in the other. "Do you take these?" The cashier was a young 20-something with floppy hair. He took the 20 and peered at it. Yeah, why wouldn't we? After a moment of tense confusion, I decided to ask directly, "What does that look like to you?" $20 bill, he replied, not sure what I was after. All right. I took normal green dollar change in return, along with a few coins. Thanks. You have a good day, sir. The blue dollars had worked. Had the cashier been colorblind? Or had I just missed some sort of new currency introduction? Just as I stepped out of the store, I leapt back from another sudden flash of black to my right. Again, nothing, but whatever I was seeing was getting closer each time. Before I could think too much more about it, I looked left and saw a tow truck hitching up my BMW. Running over to the cop and tow truck driver, I demanded an answer. The tow truck driver ignored me in favor of continuing his task. The cop peered at me for a second as if he was having trouble seeing me. Then he said, "Oh, this your car? Yeah, gotta impound it." Feeling overwhelmed by strangeness from every angle, I asked, "Why?" The cop's attention drifted back to the car. He failed to answer. Shouting fruitlessly over the noise of the tow truck lifting up my BMW, I weighed the risk of getting physical with the two men. Before I grew desperate enough to try it, I felt the torn-open envelope crinkling in my pocket opposite the cash, and I retreated to another corner of the parking lot to pull it out, study the return address, and look it up on Google Maps. My heart sank as the internet refused to work. Asking to borrow a passerby's phone, I tried their internet, but it didn't work either. I had to give them some of my blue cash to have them type it in, and they told me it was a business location downtown. Again, I paid them to call me an Uber, and then I was on my way to get some answers. The businessman I'd seen in my neighborhood was waiting on a bench outside the high-rise building. As I climbed out of the Uber, he waved me over. He had slick-backed black hair and carried a briefcase, but I knew enough about briefcases to guess that this one was mostly empty. Behind his very expensive suit, he somehow sat both stiffly and nonchalantly. He was not in the least perturbed by my wild eyes and loud voice. He held up a hand to silence me. "Your car was impounded because it was caught illegally using the roads." After a second or two spent deciphering his thick Middle Eastern accent, I sighed with unhappy realization. The opt-out? Yes. So what is it? I demanded. I can't use the roads, I can't use the internet, I can't call the police? You've opted out, he said with a matter-of-fact tone. You believe you're a self-made man who did it all himself. So now you get to keep everything you make, exactly as you've always wanted. I was just barely holding on to my rage at that point. Have you been spying on me? No. He held up a single finger and pointed at me. It's simply our target demographic for this project. You, of all people, should understand a metric like that. Actually, I did. If I was going to get out of this, I had to speak his language. So, where do you make profit on something like this? We profit every time you spend your blue dollars, he said with an uncanny smile that was not quite right. Think of it as a form of debt. And consider this conversation part of our contract. Because of certain rules, we must inform you that when you run out of blue money, we will own you. I wasn't stupid. I knew that this was a bit more than a scam. I just wasn't willing to believe, not yet, not fully, that I was dealing with more than the natural world. In either case, I had to pry more info out of him. Then I just won't spend it. I'll just use regular money. You're welcome to try. His grin somehow impossibly widened further. Good luck doing your job without the internet or the use of roads. You'll spend your blue dollars just to eat, and then we will have you. Then I'll go off the grid, find some piece of land somewhere and just grow my own food, I countered, studying the smiling mask of his face for any clues. His grin touched the edges of his cheeks, threatening to expand right off of his face the way mine had earlier that morning. You know as well as I do that everywhere is owned now. That's why this particular type of project didn't used to work. I gave up on this one when the last man I tried it on simply went out to the Wild West, as they called it, and started a new life as a farmer. There it was. He wasn't lying. I knew it in my heart. I'd told a lie or two in the pursuit of profit, and I could tell. This man had actually been alive in previous eras, which meant he was not just a human being. Then I'll go north. I'll find somewhere nobody goes, and... The businessman shook his head. You see, we've upped the effort on this one a little bit, because we can't really be having this type of reaction anymore. He turned and nodded his head toward a black blur on a distant corner. I think you will now spend your blue money on defense. Black, blurry lines sharpened into what looked like a 10 or 12-foot tall insect on 6 jointed black legs. A spiked head in the shape of a shield moved back and forth as it extended several dark horns and made a snapping noise. Time to run, the businessman said. I'd start now. And so I did. At first I was just running for my life in panic, but I turned toward a church 2 blocks down and dove inside on pure instinct. A priest was there lighting candles, and he turned at the noise of his doors opening. I walked up and asked for help, but he had trouble seeing me. It was then I knew I had not just opted out of material services. I'd opted out of whatever shared spiritual bubble humanity held that helped protect its members from them. As I ran toward another exit, the massive demonic insect skittered right inside, down the aisle, and past the priest. He was oblivious and safe from it. Cars do outrun the thing. I paid a taxi to take me to another city with my precious blue dollars and bought myself some time. But I'm down to less than $4,000 after that trip, and I can feel that the thing is still coming after me. I wrote up this story, and paid someone to post it online for me in a desperate search for help. I can't be the only one, can I? Without the police, without roads, without communication, without even the solace of a church. What can we do? There has to be more of us. We could work together, form a group, a community even. Please, there has to be more than just me in trouble this way. I can't make it alone.